ensure those doses are directed to areas where they can contribute to controlling the outbreak. I thank the European Union Commission for its donation, and we call on countries with stockpiles of vaccines with us and our partners to get those vaccines where they're needed now. We have also been supporting the DRC and other countries to ensure the necessary cold chain systems are in place to support communications campaigns to provide information about mis and disinformation. Part of the continental response plan that WHO has been developing with the Africa CDC and which we expect to publish on Friday. But it won't stop these outbreaks. We're also working to strengthen surveillance, risk communication, community engagement, clinical and home care, and coordination with partners at every level.
The testing could have been ramped up very quickly, and a few countries that have almost avoided the epidemic entirely, like Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, they took their experience and actually prepared, and so they moved a lot faster. So we, we'll have to prepare for the next one. That, I'd say is will get attention this time. Will get attention this time. Will get attention this time.
So this is a talk about gene drives. I'm going to start by telling you a brief story. 20 years ago, a biologist named Anthony James got obsessed with the idea of making mosquitoes that didn't transmit malaria. It was a great idea, and pretty much a complete failure. For one thing, it turned out to be really hard to make a malaria-resistant mosquito. James managed it finally, just a few years ago, by adding some genes that make it impossible for the malaria parasite to survive inside the mosquito. But that just created another problem. Now that you've got a malaria-resistant mosquito, how do you get it to replace all the malaria-carrying mosquitoes? There were a couple options, but plan A was basically to breed up a bunch of the new genetically engineered mosquitoes, release them into the wild, and hope that they pass on their genes. The problem was that you'd have to release literally 10 times the number of native mosquitoes for that to work. So in a village with 10,000 mosquitoes, you'd release an extra 100,000. As you might guess, this was not a very popular strategy with the villagers. Then, last January, Anthony James got an email from a biologist named Ethan Beer. Beer said that he and his grad student, Valentino Gantz, had stumbled on a tool that could not only guarantee that a particular genetic trait would be inherited, but that would spread incredibly quickly. If they were right, it would basically solve the problem that James had been working on for 20 years. As a test, they engineered 2 mosquitoes to carry the anti-malaria gene, and also this new tool, a gene drive, which I'll explain in a minute. Finally, they set it up so that any mosquitoes that inherited the anti-malaria gene wouldn't have the usual white eyes, but would instead have red eyes. That was pretty much just for convenience, so they could tell at a glance which was which. So they took their 2 anti-malarial red-eyed mosquitoes, put them in a box with 30 ordinary white-eyed ones, and let them breed. In 2 generations, those had produced 3,800 grandchildren. That is not the surprising part. This is the surprising part. Given that you started with just 2 red-eyed mosquitoes and 30 white-eyed ones, you'd expect mostly white-eyed descendants. Instead, when James opened the box, all 3,800 mosquitoes had red eyes. When I asked Ethan Beer about this moment, he became so excited that he was literally shouting into the phone. That's because getting only red-eyed mosquitoes violates a rule that is the absolute cornerstone of biology, Mendelian genetics. I'll keep this quick, but Mendelian genetics says that when a male and female mate, their baby inherits half of its DNA from each parent. So if our original mosquito was AA and our new mosquito was AB, where B is the anti-malaria gene, the baby should come out in 4 permutations: AA, AB, AA, BA. Instead, with a new gene drive, they all came out AB. Biologically, that shouldn't even be possible. So what happened? The first thing that happened was the arrival of a gene editing tool known as CRISPR in 2012. Many of you have probably heard about CRISPR, so I'll just say briefly that CRISPR is a tool that allows researchers to edit genes very precisely and easily and quickly. It does this by harnessing a mechanism that already existed in bacteria. Basically, there's a protein that acts like a scissors and cuts the DNA, and there's an RNA molecule that directs the scissors to any point on the genome you want. The result is basically a word processor for genes. You can take an entire gene out, put one in, or even edit just a single letter within a gene. And you can do it in nearly any species. Okay, remember how I said that gene drives originally had 2 problems? The first was that it was hard to engineer a mosquito to be malaria resistant. That's basically gone now thanks to CRISPR. But the other problem was logistical. How do you get your trait to spread? This is where it gets clever. A couple years ago, a biologist at Harvard named Kevin Esvelt wondered what would happen if you made it so that CRISPR inserted not only your new gene, but also the machinery that does the cutting and pasting. In other words, what if CRISPR also copied and pasted itself? You'd end up with a perpetual motion machine for gene editing. And that's exactly what happened. This CRISPR gene drive that Esvelt created not only guarantees that a trait will get passed on, but if it's used in the germline cells, it will automatically copy and paste your new gene into both chromosomes of every single individual. It's like a global search and replace, or in science terms, it makes a heterozygous trait homozygous. So, what does this mean? For one thing, it means that we have a very powerful, but also somewhat alarming new tool. Up until now, the fact that gene drives didn't work very well was actually kind of a relief. Normally, when we mess around with an organism's genes, we make that thing less evolutionarily fit. So biologists can make all the mutant fruit flies they want without worrying about it. If some escape, natural selection just takes care of them. What's remarkable and powerful and frightening about gene drives is that that will no longer be true. Assuming that your trait does not have a big evolutionary handicap, like a mosquito that can't fly, the CRISPR-based gene drive will spread the change relentlessly until it is in every single individual in the population. Now, it isn't easy to make a gene drive that works that well, but James and Esvelt think that we can. The good news is that this opens the door to some remarkable things. If you put an anti-malarial gene drive in just 1% of Anopheles mosquitoes, the species that transmits malaria, researchers estimate that it would spread to the entire population in a year. So in a year, you could virtually eliminate malaria. In practice, we're still a few years out from being able to do that, but still, 1,000 children a day die of malaria. In a year, that number could be almost 0. The same goes for dengue fever, chikungunya, yellow fever. And it gets better. Say you want to get rid of an invasive species, like get Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. All you have to do is release a gene drive that makes the fish produce only male offspring. In a few generations, there'll be no females left. No more carp. In theory, this means we could restore hundreds of native species that have been pushed to the brink. Okay, that's the good news. This is the bad news. Gene drives are so effective that even an accidental release could change an entire species, and often very quickly. Anthony James took good precautions. He bred his mosquitoes in a biocontainment lab, and he also used a species that's not native to the US, so that even if some did escape, they'd just die off. There'd be nothing for them to mate with. But it's also true that if a dozen Asian carp with the all-male gene drive accidentally got carried from the Great Lakes back to Asia, they could potentially wipe out the native Asian carp population. And that's not so unlikely, given how connected our world is. In fact, it's why we have an invasive species problem. And that's fish. Things like mosquitoes and fruit flies, there's literally no way to contain them. They cross borders and oceans all the time. Okay, the other piece of bad news is that a gene drive might not stay confined to what we call the target species. That's because of gene flow, which is basically a fancy way of saying that neighboring species sometimes interbreed. If that happens, it's possible a gene drive could cross over, like Asian carp could infect some other kind of carp. That's not so bad if your drive just promotes a trait, like eye color. In fact, there's a decent chance that we'll see a wave of very weird fruit flies in the near future. But it could be a disaster if your drive is designed to eliminate the species entirely. The last worrisome thing is that the technology to do this, to genetically engineer an organism and include a gene drive, is something that basically any lab in the world can do. An undergraduate can do it. A talented high schooler with some equipment can do it. Now, I'm guessing that this sounds terrifying. Interestingly, though, nearly every scientist I talked to seemed to think that gene drives were not actually that frightening or dangerous. Partly that's because they believe that scientists will be very cautious and responsible about using them. So far, that's been true. But gene drives also have some actual limitations. So for one thing, they work only in sexually reproducing species, so thank goodness, they can't be used to engineer viruses or bacteria. Also, the trait spreads only with each successive generation, so changing or eliminating a population is practical only if that species has a fast reproductive cycle, like insects or maybe small vertebrates like mice and fish. In elephants or people, it would take centuries for a trait to spread widely enough to matter. Also, even with CRISPR, it's not that easy to engineer a truly devastating trait. Say you wanted to make a fruit fly that feeds on ordinary fruit instead of rotting fruit with the aim of sabotaging American agriculture. First, you'd have to figure out which genes control what the fruit fly wants to eat, which is already a very long and complicated project. Then you'd have to alter those genes to change the fly's behavior to wherever you want it to be, which is an even longer and more complicated project. And it might not even work because the genes that control behavior are complex. So if you're a terrorist and have to choose between starting a grueling basic research program that will require years of meticulous lab work and still might not pan out, or just blowing stuff up, you'll probably choose the latter. This is especially true because, at least in theory, it should be pretty easy to build what's called a reversal drive. That's one that basically overwrites the change made by the first gene drive. So if you don't like the effects of a change, you can just release a second drive that will cancel it out, at least in theory. Okay, so where does this leave us? We now have the ability to change entire species at will. Should we? Are we gods now? I'm not sure I'd say that, but I would say this. First, some very smart people are even now debating how to regulate gene drives. At the same time, some other very smart people are working hard to create safeguards, like gene drives that self-regulate or peter out after a few generations. That's great. But this technology still requires a conversation. And given the nature of gene drives, that conversation has to be global. What if Kenya wants to use a drive, but Tanzania doesn't? Who decides whether to release a gene drive that can fly? I don't have the answer to that question. All we can do going forward, I think, is talk honestly about the risks and benefits.
take over.
Fucking go, Hells Angels. That's what the fuck I'm talking about. When the shit hits the fan, who you calling, huh? Roller, Colorado. Venezuelan street gangs have taken over multiple apartment complexes. I saw a video of a Target completely overrun by these savages. The local PD, the government officials, or the military have all failed to do a damn thing about it so far. Poor people out there living in fear from this Venezuelan street gang and their savages running around. Guess who's on the way, fuckers? 1%er! This is what I can gather, young lady put out a video yesterday calling out the president.
Gonna be cooking all day. I ain't your mama. I ain't gonna do your laundry. I ain't your mama. I ain't your mama. Boy, I ain't your mama. When you gonna get your act together? I ain't your mama. No, I ain't your mama. No, I ain't your mama. No. Lucky to have these curves. I ain't.
seen as a godly figure, which is ultimately fulfilling Satan's final desire in becoming a god-like figure himself, which is the true definition behind the quote, New World Order, specifically because the God of Abraham, the true God, had created all things. All these things God had created had a specific order. Satan had spent his time and efforts corrupting this holy order that God originally intended, therefore giving a new organization to the world, including all things within it. There are multiple ways Satan uses to divide and conquer, and the one of many is simply politics. Politics are an issue because it gives the mass sheep an illusion of choice. Everybody is arguing and dividing over what is called Republican and Democrat, when historically, every single president we have ever had or witnessed has caused some part of issue, all for the goal of the New World Order. Don't believe me? Let's take a look.
I'm hopeful that this fighting will not go on for long, and that casualties will be held to an absolute minimum. This is an historic moment. We have in this past year made great progress in ending the long era of conflict and Cold War. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill.
Leaders and dignitaries of the European Union, representatives of our NATO alliance, distinguished guests. We meet here at a moment of testing for Europe and the United States, and for the international order for Europe and the United States, and for the international order throughout human history. Societies have grappled with fundamental questions of how to organize themselves, the proper relationship between the individual and the state, the best means to resolve inevitable conflicts between states. And it was here in Europe, through centuries of struggle, through war and enlightenment, repression and revolution, that a particular set of ideals began to emerge. The belief that through conscience and free will, each of us has the right to live as we choose. The belief that power is just derived from the consent of the governed, and that laws and institutions should be established to protect that understanding. And those ideas eventually inspired a band of colonialists across an ocean, and they wrote them into the founding documents that still guide America today, including the simple truth that all men and women are created equal. But those ideals have also been tested here in Europe and around the world. Those ideals have often been threatened by an older, more traditional view of power. This alternative vision argues that ordinary men and women are too small-minded to govern their own affairs, that order and progress can only come when individuals surrender their rights to an all-powerful sovereign. Often, this alternative vision roots itself in the notion that by virtue of race or faith or ethnicity, some are inherently superior to others, and that individual identity must be defined by us versus them, or that national greatness must flow not by what people stand for, but what they are against.
You know, we are at an inflection point, I believe, in the world economy. Not just the world economy, in the world. It occurs every 3 or 4 generations. As one of the top military people said to me in a secure meeting the other day, 60 million people died between 1900 and 1946. And since then, we established a liberal world order, and that hadn't happened in a long while. A lot of people died, but nowhere near the chaos. And now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it, and we've got to unite the rest of the free world in doing it.
Through all of these staged events, they divide and conquer as they go. They are not as dumb as they make themselves to appear. Satan can appear as an angel of light, so these individuals make themselves appear as ministers of righteousness while they are planning on placing you and your family into a FEMA camp. Think about the many things that divides people from banding together to stand against a corrupted government. Entertainment, religion, politics, the music they listen to, false sexual identities, race, vaccines, masks, abortions, education, money, greed, selfishness, pride, materialism, and much more. These examples are the things that keep people arguing and divided against one another so that they don't focus upon the real enemy here, which are the elites. This is 2 strategies that goes by the name of divide and conquer as well as order out of chaos. The events we see such as shootings or assassinations are all staged and planned ahead of time, specifically designed to not only grab the attention of the masses, but to also cause the masses to argue against one another about pointless observations. Through these arguments, division is created amongst the masses and a feeling of untrustworthiness is created. Also, these staged events allow the elites to press forth a new law or mandate based off of the majority's belief or division. Seeing that the masses will not come together and remain divided, the question arises, who then can stop a corrupted government?
One of the most colorful characters in American history. It is said that he was born on December 29, 1809 in Boston, was the eldest son of 6 children born to Benjamin and Sarah Andrew Pike. He studied at Harvard and later served as Brigadier General of the Confederate Army. After the Civil War, Pike was found guilty of treason and jailed, only to be pardoned by President Andrew Jackson on April 2, 1866, who met with him the next day at the White House. On June 20th, 1867, Scottish Rite officials conferred upon Johnson 32nd degree Freemasonry degrees. Pike was said to be a genius, able to read and write 16 languages. He was one of the founding fathers of the head of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, being the Grand Commander of North America Freemasonry from 1859, and retained that position until his death in 1891. In 1869, he was the top leader of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Pike was said to be a Satanist who indulged in the occult, and he apparently possessed a bracelet which he used to summon Lucifer, with whom he had constant communication. He was the Grand Master of a Luciferian group known as the Order of the Palladium, or of Sovereign Council of Wisdom, as also been called, which had been founded in Paris in 1737. Now, General Albert Pike is the only Confederate general with a statue on federal property in Washington, D.C. He was honored not as a commander or even as a lawyer, but as Southern Regional Leader of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. The statue stands on a pedestal near the foot of Capitol Hill between the Department of Labor building and the Municipal building between 3rd and 4th Streets on D Street Northwest. Now, I tell you all of this because it is said that he received a vision from his mentor, Mr. Lucifer, I guess, on August 15th, 1871. And William Guy Carr, former intelligence officer in the Royal Canadian Navy, wrote a book called Satan, Prince of this World, in which he gives this information. He said that he received this information from a book written by Cardinal Caro Rodriguez in Santiago, Chile, who wrote in 1925 a book called The Mystery of Freemasonry Unveiled. And in this book, in 1925, it is said that he wrote a letter to a man named Mazzini in which he described this dream. And in the dream, he predicted 3 world wars. The First World War, he said, must be brought about, and I'm quoting from Albert Pike. The First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati to overthrow the power of the czars in Russia and of making that country a fortress of atheistic communism. The divergences caused by the agents of the Illuminati between the British and German empires will be used to foment this war. At the end of the war, communism will be built and used in order to destroy the other governments and in order to weaken the religions. Now, students of history will know that Otto von Bismarck forged certain alliances between 1871 and 1898, which brought about this war, this World War I. And Otto von Bismarck here says that he was a co-conspirator with Albert Pike, and he was the one instrumental in bringing about the First World War. Well, that's the First World War. Then he dreams that there must be, he is given in this visionary dream, a Second World War. Now remember, this was in 1925 that it became public in this book written by a cardinal from Santiago, Chile, Rodriguez. He says, quote, "The Second World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists and the political Zionists. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and that the political Zionism will be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. During the Second World War, international communism must become strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would then be restrained and held in check until the time when we would need it for the final social cataclysm." Well, there are some who may argue that the terms Nazism and Zionism were not known in 1871. You should remember, however, that the Illuminati invented both of these movements. In addition, communism as an ideology and as a coined phrase originates in France during the Revolution. In 1785, Restif coined the phrase 4 years before the Revolution broke out. Restif and Babeuf, in turn, were influenced by Rosé, as was the most famous conspirator of them all, Adam Weishaupt. Then he has this vision, in this vision, not only one world war and 2 world wars, but here comes the Third World War. He says, and I quote, "The Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agents of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world." Yeah, that's what he says. The war, this was 1925. Please understand that. At least 1925. May go all the way back to 1871, as is purported to do, but at least it was written in a book and published in 1925. So he says, after World War I was just over a few years, and before World War II even started, he's now thinking about this Third World War, and it says that it will be caused by the differences between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam, the Muslim Arabic world, and political Zionism, the State of Israel, mutually destroy each other. That's what it says. Meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on this issue, will be constrained to fight to the point of complete physical, moral, spiritual, and economic exhaustion. We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm in which, in all its horror, will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin and savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. So he's against Christianity and he's against atheism. They're supposed to fight each other to the death, you see. Then, he says, everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate those destroyers of civilization and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal, but without knowledge where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer. That's what he says. Brought finally out in the public view. So he's saying that Lucifer will finally make himself, the good guy. He's going to save the world from these atheists who don't believe in deity and from these Christians who believe in the good God. Well, so it says, this manifestation will result in the general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. Well, I don't know if it's true, but I can tell you that it sure has played into what is being carried on in the Middle East today. And it looks like everything from World War I and World War II, with the development of the State of Israel, and with the Zionist movement and the Communist movement and the atheist movement, and the peppering down of persecution on the Christians of this world, it looks like that may be Lucifer's attempt at annihilation of us all, so that Lucifer will appear in the form, of course, of what the Bible calls the Antichrist, and establish peace on earth for mankind. I got news for all those Illuminatists. Their little plan will only last for 3.5 years and will be destroyed by the second coming of Jesus Christ himself.
Turn my soul
tactics the corrupt leaders use in order to divide and conquer, separate the masses from one another, keeping them all distracted by useless opinions and entertainment, while they hide in the dark stirring the pot. You see, the issues leading to a one-world order comes in every form that we see today, and all has to do with debate. Who is right or who is wrong? Who has the greater goal and who is willing to go the furthest depths to achieve that goal? This is why deception is a dangerous thing, and yet the truth is the greatest threat to that deception. In Chicago of 1933, a so-called festival was attended by over 100,000. Reactions towards those who come forward to expose the evil and deception in this world and religion. The masses react in two different ways. First, they react to keep the lost in their place and under the enslavement of deception, whether both parties realize this or not, and simply because they are deceived into following the illusion of religion. Let us take a look at some examples of destruction that religion itself has caused. Obviously, within religion, we see the majority of it always pointing back towards Satan and self-worship. However, Christianity, the only belief that involves Jesus Christ of Nazareth and recognizes him as the Lord of Lords, continuously remains to be the most hated belief in all the world. Let us remember that verse I mentioned earlier, John, chapter 15, verse 19. If ye were of the world would love his own, but because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you.
Order from chaos is a Masonic motto, basically revolving around the principle that new orders spring from old orders being broken down. It is also a belief and something that is pushed as a concept by the World Economic Forum, that in all the chaos that is happening in the world at the moment, the vast majority of which is engineered by them, that a new order can appear, a new order can be formed. This is a great opportunity in their eyes for a great reset. And this is why it might be successful. People are absolutely ground down at the moment over the last 2 to 3 years of fighting, campaigning, expending a lot of mental energy and physical energy trying to speak the truth. Maybe a loss of finances, you could have lost your job, became estranged from your family. This all takes its toll. And when people are in a weakened state, a wearied state, they are more susceptible to be influenced and more likely to quit simply because they've had enough. I'm not saying that that's going to happen with everybody, but certainly some people have a greater capacity to deal with business like this than other people. That's just the way that it is. That's why a child, when it nags its parents incessantly for something that maybe not because they wanted to, but because they'd had enough and there's things that they wanted to do and they weren't prepared to hold out for. I get that. The same principle applies in the long run with what these globalists are trying to do. They want to grind us down. Everything is in disorder at the moment. Society is in disorder. Sexuality is in disorder. Religion is in disorder. Everything, the economy, everything, government, everything is in disorder. And from disorder, from chaos will come order, their perceived new world order, if we let them. Stay strong, stay focused, don't quit, persevere.
While this new world order is underway, many will not know what to think to themselves of how this has come. It has all been through mind control, manipulation, and simply mass consent. This has happened before on multiple occasions. However, the history has been erased because they do not want you to see the end result of what they have done before. They have had many, quote, great resets. However, this one is the most important. They have practiced this throughout many generations for this final moment, that deception they have believed all along, to become gods themselves and rule the world. So they are not going to simply let go of an opportunity such as this after generations of bloodshed. It has all come to this final moment, but what was it like before? How did they manage to get to this very point?
Hey folks, welcome to another video from A Plain Truth for You. Well, we're continuing on the Tartarian Empire, demolition, destruction, genocide, what happened to them, and their magnificent structures that seem to have been taken over by the Roman Catholics, the Romanovs. Again, the book by Fomenko, History, Science, or Fiction, the Russian Scholars, is a must-read to understand what we're talking about here. In the previous video I did on this, I showed how the railroads in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s in California make no sense at all. If it was horse and buggy days, they had built So, Lady Leah Stewart, I want to give thanks to and a shout out to for alerting me, and it also inspired me to get a spark which I had in the back of my head about what happened here in California, Marin County, where I grew up as well, which we'll get into a little later. But I just want to cover the mental institutions, the insane asylums, because I think this is where they hid a lot of the people and killed them in creating these insane asylums, taking over the Tartarian buildings, and then creating asylums so no one would question it. And if you did, you were considered insane. Anyway, so let's get into it. 19th century was a time of reform in the mental health field. The moral treatment theory of psychiatry sought to minimize the use of restraints, encourage a level of self-sufficiency, and basically treat the insane as humans instead of animals. This new line of thinking led to the building of large-scale asylum structures that still stand today. Despite some early successes, the 19th century mental institutions often fell short of their utopian goals. So you could be dunked in water. Hey, waterboarded. Nothing new under the sun, folks. And then they built these buildings in this design. And this guy, Thomas Story Kirkbride, we'll get into in a minute, that designed the asylums. You could be strapped to the tranquilizing chair for days. Tranquilizing chair, strapped for days. That would help the insane, wouldn't it? Would make them feel better. You could be forced into a straitjacket where you were sitting there used to replace iron and chains. Straitjacket gave patients a degree of freedom by preventing them from hurting themselves or others. And then you'd probably be left there for the rest of your life. I don't know what those rods are in the back of the person here, what they're trying to do, but there were very real cures for insanity in the 1800s. People often got better, or they didn't, using waterboarding. It was up to the doctor to determine whether a patient was cured. If the doctor said the patient was still insane, they were stuck there no matter how hard they argued the case. You could be locked in a self-sufficient city. Look at the building, folks. Tartarian. This is an insane asylum in the 1800s. Asylums were usually built in isolated places, which we're going to find is not true. They'd have their own bakeries, butchers, and dairy shops. By the time of Edison, many even generated their own electricity. This is for the insane in the 1800s. How many were there? Oh, there were a lot of insane people that were put in the insane asylums. Before the institutional push, the asylum patient population in England was at 10,000. By the end of the institutionalization push, it was over 100,000. You would follow a strict routine. Don't they look happy? Asylums became overcrowded in the 19th century, and the structure of treatment shifted away from the individual care and more towards hurting people and hurting. Life at the asylum was based on routines. Patients get up in the morning, leave their rooms, be ushered into common places. Sometimes they would be paraded around the grounds in between strictly scheduled communal meals and chores. Sounds like a prison to me. You get let's get over to this guy, Thomas Kirkbride. So Thomas Story Kirkbride, 1809 to 1883, was a physician, advocate for the mentally ill, and founder of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, a precursor to the American Psychiatric Association. Born into a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, he received his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania Jesuit School, 1832. He had his own practice in 1840. He became superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospitals for the Insane. If you're in your sanity, does that mean you're insane? Kirkbride pioneered what would be known as the Kirkbride Plan to improve medical care for the insane as a standardization for buildings that house the patients. Kirkbride was an advocate of building hospitals for the mentally ill in a style which he believed promoted recovery and healing. This style was used on many late 19th century hospitals, including St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and many of those buildings designed by leading architects. Leading architects are designing insane asylums. That's what they're saying here. So let's look at one. Elizabeth Hospital. Oh my gosh. Look at the figurehead. St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Hitchcock Hall. And we'll get into a few more. Center building for St. Elizabeth's, the oldest on campus, has appeared in the early 20th century. Tartarian, folks. Look at the design of this thing. All Tartarian. Washington, D.C. An elderly patient, 1917. Here's the map. Topographical, 1860. Look at how big the buildings are. 1860. How many insane are they holding? 1937, the West Campus. So St. Elizabeth's Hospital opened 1855, federally operated psychiatric hospital, the first one, housing over 8,000 patients in the peak of 1950s. St. Elizabeth's Hospital founded in August 1852 with $100,000 for the indigent residents of the District of Columbia and members of the U.S. Army and Navy with brain illness. Isn't that interesting that it wasn't until the Organic Act of February 21st, 1871 that Washington, D.C. was even created? Wikipedia lies, they just lie. All right, how about another one we got going on here? Traverse City Hospital in Traverse City, Michigan. Look at this building, folks, to house the criminally insane.
When a country centralizes banking, it concentrates an enormous amount of wealth into a single institution, works mainly to make the rich richer, and opens the government to control from foreign interests. As Bill Clinton's mentor, Dr. Carol Quigley, wrote, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralization of world economic control and use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups. As Jim Marrs said, anyone seeking to prove the existence of conspiracies in America needs look no further than the origin of our present central bank. Here is a well-documented conspiracy involving the very names tied to modern secret societies. Jordan Maxwell said, "Somebody is using us. The business of banking was set up in the year 1099. An income tax form is a 1099. Who decided on that? Think about it. With institutions like IMF and World Bank, along with new union currencies like the EU euro, further consolidating and centralizing the world's banking and currencies, the amount of worldwide influence these international bankers have on world economies and politics is extraordinary. Their method of control is just like a loan shark or the mafia. Firstly, to qualify for loans, desperate nations are forced into pawning mines, railways, forests, power, or water companies. Then to pay off the loans, nations are forced to do things like ignore environmental laws, lower wages, cut back on education or healthcare, and privatize or sell off their resources to crooked corporations like Enron and Exxon. Whenever these poor countries cannot pay off the loans, the generous international banksters simply give new, higher interest loans to pay off the old ones, further indebting and enslaving the nation. As Mayor Amschel Rothschild said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." More recently, Richard McKenna, former president of Midlands Bank of England, said, "Those that create and issue the money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in their hands the destiny of the people." Alex Christopher wrote, "It is a well-known fact that international bankers have financed nations to fight against each other. Where do you think the countries get their money to buy tanks, guns, uniforms, etc., to arm their nation for war? They borrow from international bankers. International bankers have financed both sides of countries at war with each other. They don't care who wins, because while the nations are borrowing huge amounts of money to kill each other, international bankers make huge amounts on money from the interest charges that they make each nation pay. They also have the power to control the outcome of the war by simply cutting off the flow of money they lend. So under the threat of war, international bankers have used their power to gain or increase control over governments. By keeping a nation in debt, they are in a position to demand a voice in the government affairs of the nation. Another goal, which they have already achieved, is to control all the world's monetary systems. Thomas Jefferson said, "I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies. If the American people ever allow the private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." Despite Jefferson's warnings, in 1791, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, pushed a congressional charter through to create the first Bank of the United States, which stood for 20 years, until 1811, when President James Madison and Vice President George Clinton refused to sign and renew the charter. Madison said, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling the money and its issuance." Strangely enough, only 5 years later, still under Madison's presidency, in 1816, he signed the charter for the Second National Bank. Such hypocritical action raised suspicion of bribe or blackmail at work behind the scenes. In 1828, Andrew Jackson said in a speech addressing the central bankers, "You are a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out. If people only understood the rank injustice of the money and banking system, there would be a revolution by morning." As president for the next 8 years, Jackson worked to abolish the federal charter of the Second Bank of the U.S. In 1835, an attempt was made on his life. The would-be assassin, Richard Lawrence, pointed 2 pistols at Jackson, pulled the triggers, and miraculously, both misfired. Jackson immediately proceeded to beat Lawrence with his cane. Lawrence would later tell police he wanted to kill Jackson because, quote, money would be more plenty for him, and that he, quote, could not rise until the president fell. He said the American government owed him a large sum of money, but Andrew Jackson was preventing him from receiving it. This is most definitely a reference to Andrew Jackson's struggles with the central bank, which was the obvious motivation for such an attempt on his life. In 1836, Jackson succeeded in abolishing the Second National Bank, stating, "The bold effort the present bank had made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that await the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." When asked on his deathbed what his life's greatest accomplishment was, Jackson replied, "I killed the bank." Fortunately, we were not deluded into the perpetuation of that Second National Bank, but unfortunately, we were tricked into the establishment of another, much worse than it. From 1837 to 1863 was a period of free banking in America during which only state-chartered banks existed and the values of silver and gold were very stable. In 1863, the Rothschild interests had succeeded in forcing a bill through Congress via their insider Treasury Secretary, Salmon P. Chase. He passed the National Banking Act, once again creating a federally chartered central bank, one with the power to print and issue paper money. At the time, President Abraham Lincoln fought against the central bankers and said, "The money power preys upon the nation in time of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of our country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." He was shot and killed a year and a half later in April 1865. From 1864 to 1913, the National Banking Act and the Civil War all but forced the majority of America's banks to become nationalized. The effort to create the third U.S. central bank began in 1873, when the Bloodline International Banking Cartel engineered the first of 3 financial panics which they used to scare the public into accepting the Federal Reserve. Eustace Mullins wrote, "A study of the panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 indicates that these panics were the result of the international bankers' operations in London. The public was demanding in 1908 that Congress enact legislation to prevent the recurrence of artificially induced money panic. On November 22, 1910, 7 of the richest men in the world met at J.P. Morgan's personal island retreat off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island. The 7 men were Frank A. Vanderlip, Abraham Piet Andrew, Henry P. Davidson, Charles D. Norton, Benjamin Strong, Paul Moritz Warburg, and Nelson W. Aldrich. Did otherwise when he wrote, "There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System." Woodrow Wilson had said of the earlier 3 financial crises that all this trouble could be averted if we of the United States, the Civil War, the previous panics of 1873 and 1893, and now the panic of 1907, were finally conditioned to the point of accepting the solution offered by those who had caused all of these events, the international bankers. That solution was a central bank. Jim Marrs wrote, "These men concluded not to have one central bank in the United States, but several, and they agreed that no one was to utter the words central or bank. Most important, they decided that this creation would be made to look like an official agency of the U.S. government. They called it the Federal Reserve, but it is neither federal nor a reserve. It is about as federal as Federal Express, and as much a reserve as American Indian reservations. It is a network of banks, 5 originally, now 12, headed at the New York branch. All of them, control over the U.S. Fed, is basically control over the world's money. That fact alone shows how immense the Rothschilds' power is. If one examines who has been appointed to head the Fed and to run it, the connections of the Federal Reserve System to the Rothschilds can further be seen. Another private enterprise using the name Federal that the Rothschilds also direct is Federal Express. Anyone else might be taken to court for making their businesses sound like they are government, not the Rothschilds. It is appropriate for them to appropriate the name of Federal because, by way of MI6 via the CIA, they instruct the U.S. government plan. It was clearly an effort to garner public support for the Glass Bill by the appearance of banker opposition. The appearance of opposition by Wall Street was necessary. William McAdoo, Wilson's son-in-law, who was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, later revealed, "Bankers fought the Federal Reserve Act with the tireless energy of men fighting a forest fire. They said it was populistic, socialistic, half-baked, destructive, infantile, badly conceived, and unworkable." However, McAdoo said in interviews with these bankers, "I perceived gradually, through all the haze and smoke of controversy, that the banking world was not really as much opposed to the bill as it pretended to be."
When he said this, it displayed the power he gave to the system. told Winston that he would eventually give in to this New World Order related system, that he would quote love Big Brother, and then he would die. And unfortunately, as we see in the movie, O'Brien was right. What makes it even worse is that Winston didn't even consider living the real victory. He knew he was going to die. The real victory was dying while still hating this corrupt and elite system, and even in that, he failed. The real point in this was that George Orwell was stating the truth that nobody would be safe if this real world continued to head in the direction it was going in, as we see today, headed towards this New World Order finalization. Soon, it was going to be too late, even for those who wanted to stand against it. Winston, who is looked upon as a tragic hero, in the end, he fails. He gives in, and then is killed while brainwashed into loving Big Brother or the elites. As most would expect, in most films, the hero ends up winning in the ending of most films, but considering the eerie reality of the corrupted New World Order, we are hit with a haunting truth that in the end, this hero figure, being Winston, ends up failing, not to have a hero outlook upon himself, but to ultimately fail, giving into the enemy and becoming a slave to this corrupted system. When you watch this unsettling movie, we witness a variety of enslavement tactics and mind manipulation and or abuse. Every single thought of every individual would be tracked and monitored. If the thoughts of any individual would be a thought of self-free will of any kind, they would be punished. Every individual was watched by the elite everywhere they went, in their homes, in their thoughts, outside, everywhere. Also, the words they speak, the actions they do, the food they eat, the drinks they consume, the clothes they wear, every single millisecond of a thought or action would be monitored and acted upon by the elite through numerous punishments and torture methods, whether it be no food, imprisonment, beatings, mind control, brainwashing, electrocution, isolation, etc. These methods would not only brainwash every individual, but it would teach them to hate free will and free thought unto the point where they feared this idea of free will and they feared free thought, becoming fully convinced that they themselves was a disease, perhaps their own enemy. They couldn't trust anyone, not even themselves, because everything they did from the inside out was being monitored and manipulated into what only pleased the elite rulers. This very film itself brings the unsettling reality behind the book of Revelation, chapter 14, verse 11, which states, "And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they have no rest day nor night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name." End quote. Seeing this verse, it is a simple, yet terrifying reference. We see that the simple words, "they have no rest day nor night," displays that free will ultimately be gone for those who take the mark of the beast. So something as relaxing or as freeing as rest will be completely gone and taken away. And this terrifying thought of, if rest is taken away, what else will they lose? No rest, no joy, no thought, no purpose. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 states, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." This is the great opposite from Satan, being Yeshua. He simply tells us that those of us that labor, those of us that are heavy laden, we who are exhausted, worn out and given up, the Lord will give us rest. He takes our burdens so we may relax and have this peace, this ultimate rest. However, with the mark of the beast, we are told that those who take it have no rest day nor night, showing no peace, absolute exhaustion, no rest, and day nor night displays the time frame obviously being forever, as we see in the beginning of this verse when it states, quote, "And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever." This is exactly why I stress in my personal project, in articulate installation, when it comes to something such as metaverse, there is only one reason why they would create a digital world. If they can be wise enough to build robotics and merge man and machine, then it would be common sense to understand that computers and programs are not fully trustworthy. Therefore, knowing about metaverse, this false digital world, we begin to understand that it is simply Satan's version of creation. Because Satan is not God, he cannot create, but can only manipulate, and metaverse is only a manipulated version of creation in general. Which this metaverse includes internal, possibly eternal and technological torture and error with no maintenance and no repairs. Therefore, this metaverse is the combination of the film 1984 as well as updated technology such as artificial intelligence, resulting in forever technological imprisonment with no escape. or in other words, a digital hell.